Hello YouTube, welcome back. Well, despite the current sun, it's been a really wet day here in the Northern Rivers, and up at Nutkin Farm it's rained 5 times, it's been sunny 5 times, and we've even had a combination of the two. So completely inappropriate for farming. The causeways are just about flooded and the ground is very full of moisture. So I've had to come away from the farm in order to talk to you, and it's a good day for doing that. Now, long-term subscribers will have seen this sign before, Park Properties. And for those of you who don't know, Park Properties were named after Park Street, Sydney, which this is anything but. It was the properties purchased by Kerry Packer in the 70s and set up by Bruce Chester and his father for the executives of the late business tycoon Kerry Packer. And these were basically tax sinks and gifts to them so that they could have some informal sort of superannuation before superannuation became a formal thing in Australia. So you've seen that sign, but what you haven't seen is this one. That's right, Park Properties is for sale, and this is a momentous, almost royal occasion in the macadamia industry because these properties were so typical of in fact heralded the start of the sort of tax dodge era in macadamias, where rich individuals from Sydney came up and did macadamias as a tax effective investment. And all 6 properties, it seems, are up for sale. They were last up for sale in, I think, 1991. And you can even see the brochure for the 1991 sale on one of my earlier videos with Bruce Chester. The asking price for all of the properties is $13 million. I don't know if it's worth that. I can certainly see at least $10 million in it. I don't care what anyone says. This is the premier land, both sides of Springvale Road here. This is the premier land in Eureka. It is beautiful, rich volcanic soil. Kerry Packer picked the best when he set up the farms here, and the trees, despite the fact nothing's been done to them for a while, still look incredibly healthy. Whoever buys the place, if you want to keep it as a macadamia farm, there is a lot of work to do in order to make it effective and productive again. But what a lovely parcel of land, and of course we're all crossing our fingers and hoping that nothing silly is done with it, like trying to turn it into some sort of glorified residential with a macadamia veneer. Anyway, big news in the macadamia industry, at least locally here in the Eureka district of the Northern Rivers. Let's see what happens, and I will keep you posted on that story, and may even ask Bruce Chester what he thinks about that in a future show. Meanwhile, we have other things to talk about. So I found somewhere that wasn't raining, and that's Rouse. Here I am on Red Lane, one of my favourite little areas in the Alstonville Plateau, where the orchards are pristine, well looked after. And look, it's not all good news. I'm seeing lots of green leaves and everything, but not very much in the way of nuts. These are definitely some A4 trees I'm looking at the moment, and they've got out of season flowering on them, which would be absolutely infuriating to whoever owns the farms. But yeah, lots of flowers, no nuts, and you're not meant to see that in December. In December you're allowed to look up and see what Santa brought you, but at the moment Santa looks like he's not giving macadamia farmers much of a crop this year, and that's going to factor into how much the Australian market produces. The topic of this video doesn't have much to do with that. In fact, showing you Park Properties and this topic are both inspired by the one person. Her name's Jane. She's not a macadamia farmer, but she wants to be. She wants to move back from a very urbanised environment overseas, and likes my videos of beautiful macadamia farms and wants to find the perfect forever macadamia farm for her. And like a lot of people interested in joining the industry, they worry about things. They worry about the macadamia price, they worry about the climate change, and right at the moment one of her worries is trade wars. And she asked me a very valid question, which I had to think about for a while before making this answer, and that is, what will happen to the Australian macadamia industry in the event of a trade war? And the catalyst for that is the re-election of Donald Trump in the United States and the various threats he's made, which aren't super specific in relation to what he might do with tariffs once he comes into office in January 2025. Now, this video is going to become rapidly out of date, but I thought it was a question that deserved its own video to answer. The macadamia world market isn't really the subject of many special tariffs, and the main reason for that is it's just too small a market. You know, it's not something where major changes in tariffs will send waves through an economy like it would if you, for example, farm wheat or you know, soy, or a lot of the very highly traded crops. It is, however, a durable crop. It's not fresh produce. Nuts are something that can be transferred all over the world, and obviously there are lots of markets for them. In Asia, Europe, I mean, pretty much every continent of the world will take in a certain amount of macadamias, and so on that level, it's a globally traded crop. There are trade barriers in some cases that are applied at a block level, such as the European Union and agricultural imports. Sometimes you can work around them with a free trade agreement, and Australia has free trade agreements with a number of countries. That's not the only thing that, you know, you need to get into a market. We have a good free trade agreement with India now, and we're trying to get into the Indian market, but in that particular case there are specifications and standards that have to be agreed before our nuts can be accepted into that market. Basically lots of red tape, but it's important red tape, presumably for the Indian market, and you know, these hurdles have to be overcome before the trade can be let into the country. Obviously some countries are harder than others. But when it comes to the question of punitive tariffs, our macadamias were lucky in the last 5 years in Australia, where a lot of our agricultural industries, some of which are smaller than macadamias, had punitive tariffs slapped on them by the Chinese government. You know, you can think of wine, lobsters, some other agricultural products, and what we suspected, of course, was that the tariffs were more political than anything to do with the crop itself, although there was always some excuse, like contamination was found in this lobster, or you know, pesticides were found in this particular horticultural product. And then, of course, you know, that was the excuse to slap these tariffs on, which have taken a long time to take off. Now, we're all grateful that those tariffs aren't on there. The trade war that is coming, if it's coming, is largely going to be between China and the US. That's interesting for macadamia farmers because both of those countries are customers for macadamia nuts, and Australia at one point or another may well have to pick sides in that trade war. We obviously have a big trade surplus with China. We're one of the only countries that sell more to China than China sells to us. We have a trade deficit with America. If it reaches the point where China puts in restrictions on US goods, and then, or US puts 100% tariffs or whatever tariffs they're threatening on Chinese goods, the macadamia market will be a little affected as between those two. China's a net importer of macadamias, so it's not like Chinese exports of macadamias are going to be hurt. But in terms of importing, well, if there's imports put on US macadamias, then in theory any exports going from Hawaii to China, and I don't know that there's that many of them, would be affected. So if you look at it in terms of those two relationships, not a lot is going to happen to macadamias from Australia, so long as the trade tariffs that China imposes aren't also imposed on Australia, because obviously that would make our exports of macadamias less competitive, and that's the last thing we need. Being a relatively high cost country, we don't need any more costs imposed on us. We're already struggling as it is to stay competitive on some aspects, not quality, but certainly on raw price. The more interesting and potentially scary interaction is the threats the Trump administration is making against BRICS. Now BRICS, which is BRICS, stands for, I think, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. It's not only those countries, there's a few others. I think Egypt and Ethiopia and the United Arab Emirates are in there as well. But they're called BRICS. That's a bloc that was founded in about 2009, but we're only really hearing about it in a major way now because there's an agenda from these BRICS countries to try and move trade away from the US dollar, try and de-emphasize trade with America and open up, I guess, the global south and these other sorts of areas to alternative trade force to things like the US, which is a force in its own right, and the European Union, which collectively is also a large force in the world markets. And their attempts at achieving sort of dominance or removing the US dollar as a main trading currency has caught the ire of Mr. Trump, and he says, I might slap 100% tariffs on goods from BRICS and attempt to shut it down very quickly, because none of those countries can really afford to lose access to the American market in terms of the exports. Now, the reason that is interesting is because BRICS contains two vital countries, one of which is India, which we're obviously trying to market to. We've got our own free trade agreement with India, but again, if there's a trade war and tariffs get put on between groups of countries, so that if you're not in a group, you'll have a tariff imposed. If we're not in BRICS, for example, we might have a tariff imposed on our goods. These sorts of decisions can rapidly make free trade agreements obsolete, because particularly where there isn't much rule of law, you've got what you think is a deal and it just gets taken away from you with the stroke of a pen. The risk there is if the world develops into blocks and Australia isn't really part of any block, we want to do trade with everyone rather than just a particular block, then we could be potentially shut out of India, which is a budding market, and then China, which is already a major market for Australian nut in shell, and one where we really haven't faced many trade barriers yet. But to face them for the first time, if there's a trade war and BRICS is sort of declaring war on everyone else, that potentially is scary. But that's not the only ripple in the ocean, because BRICS also contains South Africa. And if the US puts tariffs on South Africa, then South Africa, as the world's largest producer of macadamia nuts, is going to be affected, and I would imagine quite negatively, because the US is a key export market for South Africa. If the trade war extends to the European community and they put up tariff barriers against everyone as well, South Africa might lose out there. On the other hand, South African macadamia nuts could always go to China and India, who are within BRICS and who of course are target markets for the South Africans as well. So what does this mean for poor little old Australia? Well, we're not a member of any trade bloc, like I said, and we would obviously try and get free trade agreements with everyone we can. We don't hold that much muscle in free trade negotiations because we're a country of less than 30 million people, and while we have some domestic market, it's not going to make or break any other country, except perhaps New Zealand, whether they trade with us or not. In general terms, and look, I say this as having studied economics at university, but I'm not an economist, but in general terms, trade wars hurt everyone. There isn't really a winner. If you reduce the amount of trade between countries, it just means that everyone does less business, because there are, whatever tariffs you put up, there's a retaliatory move that hurts your economy just as badly, and it becomes very much a lose-lose as people sort of close barriers in on each other. And little countries like Australia can get buffeted by blanket tariffs unless we negotiate an exception to those rules. We did at one point, have some success with the previous Trump administration, where there was going to be some tariffs slapped on steel. We got Australian steel exempted from that so that we could still export some steel to the US. Not a big deal, but it's again something where if it happened with macadamias, we'd be very reliant on the Australian Macadamia Society and of course other horticultural bodies and the Australian Department of Trade to negotiate some exceptions for us. And macadamias aren't really a politically sensitive crop, or at least not as far as I can tell. So we're at least a chance of being protected from the worst of the fight. But what happens then if everyone puts up barriers and all of a sudden everyone we export macadamias to has got these tariffs? Well, one thing you do learn in economics is that when people aren't able to buy your goods, the value of your currency can drop, and because there's fewer goods leaving the country, fewer people buying Australian goods, we on the other hand have to buy goods in from overseas. And you can go back to the days where Australia had a very low currency, something under 50 US cents. Now what that can do as a balancing mechanism is it can actually adjust for the effects of tariffs, because if the Australian dollar drops overly low, that makes our exports cheaper. And so even with the tariffs in place, we might be able to sell competitively to the countries who are putting tariffs on us. The fact that tariffs are placed on some countries' nuts and not on others, it doesn't delete them from the world market. It can have very different pricing impacts on a lot of different people, and you've got to have a look at that globally and say, okay, if you can't sell your nuts to China, for example, Australian nuts may well flood into the rest of the world market in order to be sold more cheaply somewhere else, and you may well end up with a response that says, well, you process more of the nuts here in Australia and ship processed products that aren't the subject of tariffs. So it's not really just a binary equation, and when you look at things like trade wars, you've got to look at how people try and get around them. It's a bit easier with horticultural crops than it is, for example, with cars, where you see any Chinese manufacturers setting up factories in Mexico in order to take advantage of the good trade deal Mexico has with the US. Well, Trump's now saying you can build all the factories in Mexico you like, but if you try and ship cars to the US from there and get in under the barriers, I'm going to put punitive tariffs on them. So forget about it. Macadamias, you can sell them as nut and shell. They can go via third countries. They are fairly durable in the shell, and you get the feeling that a bit like other primary goods that last a long time, they'll get around the world market one way or the other. It's really just a question of what's going to happen to the price of macadamias, particularly for countries like Australia, who might be too small to be included in the trade war, or an unwitting casualty of the trade war between other larger powers. When could this happen? Well, if Trump gets in January 25, or he is getting in January 25, and those tariff wars start, then Australia's got a lot of diplomacy ahead of it, I suspect, and we've got to see if we can get exempted from the tariffs that are going to come in, and we'll see. That would affect, in theory, the season's crop coming up, however much of it that is, and you know, we'll have to see who our partners are. I think there's bigger questions ahead for countries like South Africa, who are, you know, they're a member of BRICS, but you know, a lot of the markets that they're selling to, particularly Europe and the US, South Africa is going to have to make some decision about it. Look, are you part of the Western world, free democracies of the rule of law, or aren't you? I mean, I don't want to be derogatory about BRICS, but there's a lot of countries in there who might be your friends one minute, but not necessarily forever. And you've got to take a look at, you know, to what extent your country is going towards these other countries in BRICS. Is the exchange simply one where, you know, financially it's okay while it lasts, or do we look for something a bit more durable and something where you've got trade partners that you can depend on long term, or, you know, are you going for short-term gain from markets who are giving you that gain at the moment? Now, I don't have an answer. There's no easy answer. I'm not trying to get political about anything myself. I just think that you know, we're reaching a stage where if there is a trade war, and hopefully Australia doesn't have to choose sides, you know, we are going to be faced at some point with a round of learning the lessons of history all over again, which, you know, unfortunately we might have to do, even though they've already been well and truly learned by the economists, and work in a world where we have to be more innovative about how we sell our nuts in a more closed world market. Food for thought. I'd love any contributions from anyone who'd like to chip in. I don't think it's a particular worry for us, is the main message of this video, but it's a watch this space. Thanks for watching today's video. There will be another one soon. Stay well and hopefully dry. Bye for now.